V'oretz lo simocher litzmisus. When you sell your property in Eretz Yisrael, you cannot sell it litzmisus, meaning where you terminate a relationship. The seller cannot terminate the relationship with the property that he owns, which is the original family heirloom, which was divided by Yeshua and was given to the family. The person cannot sell it beyond the 49th year. So Rashi says, what's litzmisus? Psuka lo lomus. A sale where what's being transferred never comes back. Why? Lioretz, because the land is mine. Meaning you have tenant rights. And because you have tenant rights, therefore your rights are only 49 years. You can't sell more than the right that you have. And the owner only allows you to rent it, to sublet it for 49 years. It's like a sublet. As the one who originally received the land, you're the tenant forever. But the sublet clause in the contract is only you could sublet it for 49 years. After 49 years, it must come back to you. So if you go and you sublet it beyond that, it's not valid. It's not a valid transfer of rights, because those rights you had never had a right to transfer to this subtenant. He gave it to Shavim Atemi Modi, because you're Gerim, you're strangers and citizens with me. All you're a citizen of the land, but who is the owner of the land? It is my land. And I'm only giving you rights in the land. So Rashi says, what's Kili Oretz? Altera beinechabo. You don't have to feel you're being denied, because factually it was never yours. It was never meant to be yours in terms of to be able to sublet it for more than 49 years. Kili Oretz. Okay? Outside of Eretz Yisrael, person owns a piece of property. It's yours for now, it's yours forever. So if you choose to terminate your ownership rights by transferring it to a third party, that your rights that you own forever to give to a third party, it's your right. Because that's not a right of usage. Factually, the property is yours. It's not only the usage of the property is yours. So therefore, once you transfer it, it belongs to the one who actually purchases it. Eretz Yisrael, that's not the case. It's a lease, and the lease agreement is for you to use it, you could use it forever. Every 7th year, you cannot take its produce. You could use the land. You want to build a building on it, you want to dry your crops on the land, you can't. But agriculturally speaking, every 7 years, the produce is ownerless. That's the rights which the owner of the property gives you. So 6 years you have, the 7th year you have no right. Every 50th year, the 50th year is like the 7th year. So the 50th year, you have 2 consecutive years, the 49th year, the 50th year. You have no rights to the produce. You must leave the produce ownerless. You're not permitted to agriculturally be involved in the land, working the land to any degree. That you're not permitted. And in terms of selling it beyond that, to sell beyond your rights, you can't sell it. Meaning you can't, because it's factual, you don't own it for that. Therefore, you can only transfer the right you have. Lioretz. Okay? So why Eretz Yisrael not? So he says, because Gerim v'toshavim atemi modi. Because you are strangers in the land, meaning you're not owners. You have right of usage. Elsewhere in the world, you own. Now, there's a Maral in the Grus Hashem, which we studied a number of years ago. Yechezkel HaNavi says, regarding the Egyptians, Besar Chamor Besoram, that the flesh of the Egyptians are like the flesh of donkeys. That's what the Egyptians are. So the question is, a donkey is a beast of burden. A donkey is considered like the most intelligent creature. I mean, we're talking about Egypt was the height of civilization. In every aspect, in terms of its advanced level of many things. So why are they depicted by Yechezkel HaNavi as chamori, as donkeys? So the Maral of Prague explains, in Hebrew, the word chomer means material, meaning of all the 70 nations, which are the root nations of the world, each nation has another level capacity of spirituality. They have a different spiritual core. the Egyptians of all 70 nations are the least spiritual of all 70 nations. They're the most chomer. They have greater relevance to the material makeup than other nations. Therefore, as a result of that, because they're so spiritually devoid, there's such a spiritual vacuum, therefore, what do you find in Egypt? You find witchcraft, which has to do with the nether forces at this extreme level. Because there's a void of spirituality, what's there instead of that? You have the other force, which represents most negative, which is the antithesis of Kedusha, of spirituality. That's the meaning of Besar Chamor Besorim. So when Hashem divided the world, this is the Maral, he divided the world among the 70 nations. Each nation, based on its spiritual makeup, has relevance to that location, because that location, in terms of the archangel, which was given overseas, has relevance to that location based on its capacity of spirituality. Egypt, the land of Egypt itself, is that location has the least level of spirituality, and because Egypt are Chamorim, they have the least relevance to spirituality, they were given that location. That's Mitzrayim. Those are the Egyptians. Because Besar Chamor Besorim, because their flesh is the flesh of donkeys, therefore they were given that location, because they're the least spiritual. This is the Maral of Prague. He speaks why we went to Egypt, why the Golus exile had to be Egypt, that location rather than anywhere else. And the Maral presents a principle, which we'll discuss in a moment. Now, every location in the world has an archangel. And the archangel oversees that nation that's meant to be in that location. The Gemara tells us in Ksubis, if you live outside of Israel, it's like you have no God if you're a Jew. What does that mean? So the Marsha, who's the commentator in the back of the Gemara in Ksubis, explains, based on the Ramban, that every location has an archangel, and if a Jew lives anywhere in the world other than Eretz Yisrael, all the sustenance that comes to that location goes through that archangel, so the Jew is receiving that sustenance based on what was determined for that location in the world. But if you live in Eretz Yisrael has no archangel because it's Hashem's domain. So if the Jew lives in Eretz Yisrael, the relationship comes directly from Hashem. It doesn't go through an archangel. But if you live anywhere else in the world, because that location is under the so-called under the control of that archangel, as each nation has an archangel, therefore the Jew is detached. There's arm's length from Hashem if you live anywhere else other than Eretz Yisrael. Therefore, if you live outside of Israel, you're slightly detached from Hashem, because there's this distance due to the archangel between you and Hashem. That's how the Marsha explains the Gemara Ein Lo Eloka. Now, over here, there's a beautiful Sipurno. We say in Hallel, in Tilim, Hashemayim Shemayim Lashem, V'aretz Nasan Lifnei Odom. Heaven is God's, and the earth, the terrestrial level, was given to mankind. What does that mean? So the Gemara Brachos explains, the two psukim, there's a contradiction in Tilim. David says, Lashem Ha'aretz V'Loah. The world's in its entirety is God's, including the terrestrial. Then David says, Ha'aretz Nasan Lifnei Odom. So how do we reconcile? Lashem Ha'aretz V'Loah, the world in its entirety is God's, includes the terrestrial. And then he says, no, Ha'aretz Nasan Lifnei Odom. So the Gemara answers in Brachos, Kan Kodem Brocha, Kan Lacha Brocha. Before you acknowledge that God is the master and the Almighty, even the terrestrial is God's. Once you make that acknowledgement by saying Hashem Elokeinu Melech Olam, and you make that verbal acknowledgement, that's the release. Hashem transfers what's all his into man's domain. It goes into the mortal's domain. This is what the Gemara answers. The Sephar over here says something beautiful. When David says in Tilim, Haaretz Nasan Lifnei Odom, that's every location in the world except for Eretz Yisrael. Why? Ki li kol haaretz. In Israel, it's li kol haaretz. Even after the world was given to mankind, it's their domain, and they dictate every aspect of that domain. That's every location in the world except Eretz Yisrael. Why Eretz Yisrael not? Ili kol oretz, because the land is mine. It was never meant, and it was never transcended outside of my domain. As a result of that, we find Eretz Yisrael is bound by many laws. You have to tithe the produce, the crops, the grain. You have to leave you have to leave the gleanings of the field to the poor. There are many laws in Eretz Yisrael which are specific and unique to Eretz Yisrael, which have no relevance out. The Shmitta years, the sabbatical year, the Yovel. Every one of these laws have relevance to Kedusha. There's such a thing as Kedusha Shvius. The produce of Shvius has a sanctity to it. Therefore, it comes to a certain point, you're not permitted to retain it. It has to be destroyed. Why? Produce anywhere else, there's no expiration unless it spoils. The answer is Kili Koloretz, that since it's God's domain, when Hashem said, Horetz Nasan live in the Odom, that location was not transferred to man's domain. Therefore, it retains that holiness. But why was it transferred? Because initially, every location in the world was given over to be overseen by the archangel. So the archangel is only able to release it to his people only at a certain point. So when the Jew lives in Chutz Loretz, you're living in whose domain? You're living in man's domain. When you live in Israel, you live in God's domain. Therefore, the Chazal tell us that a person who does a mitzvah in Eretz Yisrael, the same mitzvah, with the same level of intent, with the same focus, the value of mitzvah in Eretz Yisrael is greater than doing the mitzvah, performing that mitzvah Chutz Loretz. Why? Because when you're in Eretz Yisrael, these are the words of Chazal, you're bepalten shel melech. You're doing the mitzvah in the palace of the king. When you do a mitzvah outside Eretz Yisrael, you're not within the palace. You're outside of the palace. Everything is God's. However, you're at a distance. So when you do something special in the presence of the king, it has greater value. If a person sins in the presence of the king, the transgression is much more extreme. The same chet that one does outside of it, so you do an Eretz Yisrael, it's a much more extreme level of violation. But it's the same sin? No, because it's bepal shel melech, because it's considered you're in the palace of the king. When you do it in his presence, it's much more severe. But again, why? Because there's no separation between Hashem and the dwellers in Eretz Yisrael, and as a result of that, it's considered either has greater value or more severe. There's a Rebbeinu Bach who says something phenomenal. We find that when did Hashem say the land of Canaan is l'chol zarecha achrecha? The land is yours and to your progeny after all future generations. That was contingent on the bris. When Avram was given the mitzvah of bris milo, and he says, now that we have this covenant between us, now the land is yours and your progeny. So Rebbeinu Bach writes, you'll find throughout history, when the Christians came to conquer with the Crusades to take Israel, Yerushalayim, the majority of them were killed. Why were they killed? Because the land will not tolerate a person who is not circumcised. That they should take control over Israel. We uncircumcised, the land will spit them out. And that's the reason why they had those tremendous losses of lives. The land will not tolerate their existence there. So he says, so what about the Arabs? What about Bnei Yishmael? He says, Bnei Yishmael, because they're partially circumcised. That's the reason why the land will tolerate them. The Jews which are totally circumcised, because there's a difference between circumcision of a Jew and the Arab, therefore the land is theirs forever. Circumcision, being a mole, is a prerequisite to be able to be there. If you're not a mole, the land will not tolerate you. The Arab, which is partially circumcised, it will tolerate it up to a point. But when Mashiach will come, which is V'hoya Hashem Melech Haloretz, even the Arab, it's not his forever. He will be actually removed from the land. It's the land that was given to the Jews, and that was the covenant of the bris. How do we understand it? So Rebbeinu Bachya says, because we've discussed this many times, what does the orlo, the foreskin, represent? It represents the evil of the Eitz Hadas. And because it represents that evil, it's only once it was given to Avram Avinu that when he removes that orlo, the inner covering of the heart, the spirituality of the Jew is released, and now the Jew could have relevance to Hashem. Therefore, it's God's land, That domain was never given over to mankind. You have to have the persona or the profile which has relevance to Hashem. That means you're circumcised. The non-Jew, even if he's circumcised, it's purely cosmetic. In terms of the effect of the Eitz Hadas is still on the non-Jew. He has the Orlas Halev. He has every spiritual blockage. Therefore, the land will not tolerate him. But this is Kili Horetz. Because that location in the world, when it says Oretz Nosal L'Bnei Odom, that location was never given over to man. That's Hashem's domain. Therefore, you have to meet certain criteria to be able to be there. One of them is you have to be what level of circumcision, where the circumcision is not purely superficial, but rather it's integral to the whole spiritual makeup of the person. But therefore, it's Kili Koloretz. We had our Chaim HaKodesh before in Tazria, Mitzorah, it says that the person finds a leprous lesion or besoro on the skin of his flesh. He goes to the Kohen evaluates it. Is it leprous? Not leprous, and makes his pronouncement. So the Chaim HaKodesh asks the question, what does it say, or besoro? It should say bisoro. You find the leprous lesion on your flesh. Why? On the skin of your flesh. It's understood. Leprosy, you see it on the skin. What does that say, or besoro? So or Chaim HaKodesh explains that what the tzaras represents is something very negative. Represents an impurity, spiritual impurity. A Jew, it's only superficial. It's on the or. It's not the flesh itself. A non-Jew, the basar itself is the tzaras. The essence of the Jew it exists in a contaminated state. He is contaminated. Therefore, the laws of leprosy have no relevance to a non-Jew. If a non-Jew contracts whatever this leprosy is, the Kohen can pronounce him today forever. It doesn't make a difference. Because the essence of the non-Jew is that. The Jew, whose essence is removed from that, so even when he's affected because he failed spiritually, at worst, it's only superficial. The neshama is not impacted. So the essence of the Jew had through the circumcision, had that negativity, that representation removed. As a result of that, the non-Jew, even if he's circumcised, it's the basar's tummy. The actual essence has the arlo. The Jew, when you remove the outer foreskin, you remove the inner blockage, which is a representation of that. Therefore, the Jew has relevance to be in Eretz Yisrael, and the non-Jew not. This is like elucidation of Rebbeinu Bachya, why the land will not tolerate the Christian and does tolerate the Arab, because the Arab is partially circumcised, because the mitzvah was given to Avram Avinu to circumcise Yishmael. So Yishmael is partially impacted. The evil that represents is partially minimized, and therefore he could be there. Gemara tells us, Avira da'ara machim, that if you live in Eretz Yisrael, you have a greater level of clarity because the atmosphere is machkim. The atmosphere engenders wisdom. What does that mean? Why? For the Eretz Yisrael, you have greater relevance to clarity, to come upon the truth. Ichutz lor, it's not. Avir da'ara machkim. So the way we're explaining it is this. What is the basis of truth? God himself. We speak about Chosom Shel Kodesh Baruch Hu. The signet of God is truth. When you live in Chutz La'aretz, it's like you have a beacon of light and it shines from a distance. Whatever the intensity of that beacon of light is, the farther the light shines, it's dimmer based on the distance from the source. The closer you are to that light, it's more intense. In Eretz Yisrael, there's no separation between God and the dwellers, whoever lives there. As a result of that, the level of clarity is greater. Avira da'ara machim, the avir, the atmosphere of Eretz Yisrael is machim. It engenders wisdom. Chutz la'aretz, where you have the archangel, you have this separation between yourself and HaKadosh Baruch Hu in terms of the energies that come. It comes through, it's filtered through the archangel. Therefore, it's arm's length. It's not the same. As a result of that, the level of clarity you could have in Eretz Yisrael, you don't have a chutz la'aretz for this reason. For the same reason, li kol haaretz, a chutz la'aretz is not li kol haaretz. That's what I would say. However, you see from the Gemara in the Dorim What I'm saying is not really correct. Why? Maybe it is, maybe it's not. The Gemara tells of her story. Ula was a student of Rabbi Yochanan. They always find Ula Rabbi Yochanan in Shas. Ula said the name of Rabbi Yochanan. Ula was a student of Rabbi Yochanan. And Ula very often would travel to Bavel and travel back to Eretz Yisrael, where he studied from Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan was the leading Torah sage in Eretz Yisrael. And he's traveling from Bavel to Eretz Yisrael, and he has two members of the Mechuzah community. There's a community in Bavel called Mechuzah. And these two people, they get into an argument. One takes out a knife and slits the other one's throat. Two Jews. And after he slits the other person's throat, he says to Ula, Rabbi, did I do a good job? He says, phenomenal. You should cut a little bit more. And he cuts a little bit more because he was afraid if he doesn't somehow condone this, he'll be the next victim. So all along, Ula was worried that maybe he was an accomplice for a person's life to be taken because he encouraged him to cut a little bit more. So he comes to his Rebbe, Rabbi Yochanan, he comes to Yerushalayim, and he tells Rabbi Yochanan how he was involved, how he suggested he should cut a little bit more. Does he have to do tshuva? Is the accomplice to murder? So he says, no. Once he slit his throat, his life was over. Just a question of how quickly he would die. So cutting more or less doesn't make a difference. But he says, Rabbi Yosef, but what I can't understand, I'm taken about, it says in the Tochacha, that when you go into exile, there you will have this enraged heart. So a person to lose this level of control, it's when you're there. In Eretz Yisrael, that level of losing control doesn't exist. So if that's the case, how did the man work himself up to such a level? He's a Jew, to be so enraged that he should kill his fellow Jew. That's the question. That's what I'm thinking about. How's this possible? Because it says, so Ula says to his Rebbe, he says, Lo avarna yardona. It happened before we crossed the Jordan. It didn't happen after we crossed the Jordan. We were on the other side of the Jordan. We were still in Chutz La'aretz. So because we were still in Chutz La'aretz, which represents Golus, so therefore, Shom Levragos. There you have this enraged heart. Therefore, a person has this short fuse, and he could come to this type of situation. But again, so what do you see from there? It has to do with what? It's an enraged heart. It's a level of agitation, subliminal agitation, that you could set a person off in a level where he loses control. And Eretz Yisrael, you don't have that level of agitation, therefore you have the control. So it seems to me it's not because a person, what's clarity based on? Focus. If you have any level of distraction, you're less focused. That's what you said. It's not because of the proximity. Do you have some interference? Don't you have interference? And so has no archangel. Chutz La'aretz has an archangel. That's what it seems from that Gemara. But could be, it means that when you're closer to the source, naturally there's greater tranquility. When you sent to Golos and the Father pushes you away, you no longer have that sense of security or spiritual attachment. Therefore, you have this insecurity or lack of focus, and therefore you have greater relevance to agitation. Should have recorded that. When you bring up the Bikurim, who brings the Bikurim and who makes the declaration of Bikurim? It's only if it's your land. There's a discussion. What about if you rent the land? You lease it. Do you have to, is the Kriyas Bikurim? So there's a whole discussion in Baba Basra to say, Kinya Pers, Kinya Aguf. When you have the rights of the produce, is that like you own the land? It's a question. What it will get, the whole declaration of Bikurim will bring it, it's an expression of what? Of thankful. We're thankful to God that He gave us the land. This is the produce. After everything's said and done, this is the produce. You understand? Somebody gave my ancestor land in wherever it is, outside of Israel. I'm thankful. But it was so many generations, millennia back, it's our land. Or somebody owned it and he gave me the rights. It was his land, he gave it to me. And Eretz Yisrael, it's always his land. He never gave away that land. Every person lives there, it's tenant rights. God is the landlord. He's giving you the right to use the land. Kili koloretz. As a result of that, that's where you make the declaration of thankfulness by Kriyas Bikurim. But if you go and lease it to a third party, why does the third party have why is he bound? Because his landlord is only a tenant. What you have is only a sublet contract. A sublet contract, who you thankful to the one who sublet it to you. But the one is the tenant, who's he thankful to? To the landlord. Who's the landlord? Hili koloretz, that's Hashem. So therefore only he says has to be Kriyas Bikurim, not the person who rents it or purchases it, because he purchased it, he's the subtenant of the one who owned it when he came into Eretz Yisrael, because his ownership rights is only tenant rights.